Imagine you're in a situation where the air around you seems different, like something invisible is watching you, but you can't see what it is. That kind of silence that isn't calm, you know? It's a heavy silence. You can almost feel it pressing down on your chest, like the whole place knows something you don't know yet. Now I'm going to tell you a story I experienced when I was a child. I grew up in a place like that, isolated from the world, far from electricity, far from everything. The house where I lived was in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by trees so tall that their tops disappeared into the sky. We lived a simple life, you know? Everything we needed came from the land around us. My father grew what we ate, my mother took care of what needed to be done, and my brothers and I helped out where we could. But in the midst of all that isolation, there was always a feeling, something I couldn't quite explain. It was a strange feeling, like there was always something lurking. You know that feeling, right? That chill that starts at the back of your neck and runs down your spine? Well, I felt that all the time, especially at night, when everything was quiet. And the house, oh, the house, it had a life of its own. The fire in the fireplace lit the rooms with a dim light, and the shadows dancing on the walls seemed to have shapes. Sometimes I would stare at one of these shadows for a long time and feel like it was actually moving. But my parents always said it was my imagination. But I felt like it wasn't just in my head. The first time I realized something really strange was going on was one winter night. Outside, the wind was blowing so hard that the tree branches were banging against the windows as if they were trying to get in. I was lying in my bed, wrapped in the sheets, trying to keep warm, when I heard a pop. It sounded like a branch breaking, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It came from inside the house. At the same time, my whole body tensed up. What could have made that noise? My father and mother were sleeping in the next room, as were my brothers. There was no one else in the house, or so I thought. I closed my eyes, hoping the sound wouldn't come back, but then another creaking sound. Closer this time, like something was walking through the house, very slowly. I held my breath and stood completely still, listening. And then I saw it. The shadow. She was standing in my bedroom doorway. She wasn't just any shadow. She was very tall, taller than anyone I knew. And she stood still, not moving, as if she was watching me. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move a muscle. I just lay there, staring. Suddenly, my bedroom door slammed shut on its own. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, walking through the house, from one room to another. It was like the thing was checking every room, seeing who was in. I wanted to run to my parents' room, but I couldn't move because I was so scared. Finally, I worked up the courage and ran to his room. My father was already awake, a serious expression on his face. I had heard footsteps, too. We searched the entire house, but there was no one. Nothing out of place, no open doors, nothing. But that feeling that something had been there, it didn't go away. After that night, strange things started happening more frequently. Doors slammed shut, objects moved, and the silence outside in the woods became even heavier. It felt like the trees were watching us, and when we left the house at night, we always felt like we weren't alone. One day, my father decided he was going to cut down some trees around the house. He thought that with more space, that oppressive feeling would go away. He spent the whole day with the axe, cutting down tree after tree. When night fell, I thought maybe everything would be quieter. But that's not what happened. That night, I woke up to a different sound. It was like someone was whispering, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. I got out of bed and walked over to the window, and outside, among the trees my father had cut down, they were standing again. Not the same ones, but new trees, in the exact spot where the old ones had fallen. And in the middle of them, I saw a tall, bright-eyed figure stood among the trees. She looked straight at me. unblinking, unmoving. She was just there, waiting. I ran back to bed and hid under the covers. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, the trees were still there, as if nothing had happened. My father was perplexed, but he didn't say anything. He knew, as did my mother, that this wasn't normal. A few days later, we moved. My mother said that the forest didn't want us there, that it was better to leave while we could. To this day, when I think of that house and that forest, I get goosebumps. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I feel like that presence is still with me, waiting, as if I had never left that place behind. I hope you liked the story, because the second story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. Imagine what happened to me was something like that, but much more disturbing. Let me tell you clearly, because to this day, when I think about it, I feel a chill running down my spine. It was summer, right after I finished 4th grade. At the time, my biggest concern was whether I would be able to get good grades or not and how I would spend my vacation days. My father had given me a simple task, to help mow the lawn in the garden and pull out the weeds that were taking over the garden. And you know how it is, when you are a child, every little thing seems like a big adventure. The first time I noticed something strange was while I was standing there with the lawnmower going back and forth. Suddenly, a chill ran through my body, as if someone had passed an icy hand across my neck. I looked around but saw nothing. I continued on, thinking it was just the wind. Only, in an instant, I saw something at the edge of our property, right there among the trees surrounding the yard. It was strange. You know when you see something that doesn't make sense and then you try to convince yourself that you're imagining it? I thought, it must just be a branch or maybe a shadow, no big deal. But something inside me, something deep, knew it wasn't. There, standing among the trees, was a figure. It wasn't just any shadow. It was tall, thin, and looked human, but at the same time, not quite. In the days that followed, I tried to ignore it. You know how it is, right? The child tries to push away strange thoughts, as if he could chase away the fear by simply pretending it didn't exist. But the problem is, even if I tried to convince myself that there was nothing there, that figure was still there, and always in the same place. It was as if she was watching me. She didn't move, she didn't make a sound, she just stared. At first I thought it might be a strange tree, or even a large animal, who knows? But it wasn't. And over time I started to notice details. He was wearing dirty, tattered clothes, almost like he had stepped out of a horror movie. And the worst part of all? He had no face. Or at least I couldn't see him properly. It was like the shadow of the trees and the setting sun hid every detail of his face, but I knew he was staring at me. At first I tried not to tell anyone. Have you ever felt this? That feeling that if you tell people, people will laugh at you or say it's all in your head. I didn't want my parents to think I was making up stories just to get out of yard work. But with each passing day, the presence of that man in the shadows grew stronger and stronger. He was always there, standing there, staring at me. One time I even tried to stare back at him, you know? Like, I'm not scared of you. But man, I was terrified. And no matter how hard I looked at him, he didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't take a step. I just watched. After a few weeks, I started having nightmares. I dreamed he was closer, walking across the yard and to my window, watching me as I slept. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, and run to the window to check. He was never there, but the feeling that he could be, it was suffocating. Things started to get worse when I realized that he didn't just show up when I was in the yard. One morning I woke up and felt the same familiar chill. I looked out my bedroom window, which looked out onto the yard, and there he was, interrupted, staring at me. Only this time he was closer. He was no longer at the property line. He had taken a few steps toward the house. It was then that I realized that this was no longer a coincidence. This man, this thing, was coming toward me, and every day he got closer. I tried to tell my parents, but of course they laughed. "It's just your imagination," they said. "You've been watching too many movies." But I knew it wasn't imagination. How could it be? I saw him every day, closer and closer, more and more real. One night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the cold coming from outside. I knew he was there, waiting. I didn't want to, but something inside me forced me to get up. I walked to the window, and when I pulled back the curtain, there he was. And this time he was in the middle of the yard, almost in the shadow of the house. My heart was beating so loud I thought I could hear him. He was very close now, and suddenly he moved. It was the first time I saw him move. He slowly started walking towards the house. Every step he took seemed to echo inside my head. I froze in fear, unable to scream, unable to move. He continued walking, until he was right under my window. I could see better now. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, well, I don't know if I can call them eyes. They were deep, black holes that seemed to absorb all the light around them. And then he raised his head and looked straight at me. It was enough. I screamed and ran to my parents' room, crying, calling for help. They finally heard me and came with me to the window. But of course, when we got there, he was gone. I never saw him again after that night. But the feeling that something was watching me never completely went away. And to this day, when I look out at the edge of the trees at night, I feel like he's still there, waiting for the right moment to return. I hope you liked the story, because the third story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories. I hope you liked the story. Imagine you're finishing another night shift. The city, which during the day is full of people, noise, and movement, now seems like a completely different place. You drive through the streets, the lights flickering on and off, and that strange feeling starts to take over you. It's hard to explain, but you feel like you're being watched, even though you know you're completely alone. Most people think that working at night is peaceful. Little traffic, few people on the streets. But they don't understand how strange it is to be awake and active when the rest of the world seems to have shut down. The streets are so empty that even the slightest breeze seems to make noise. You hear the swaying of tree branches, the barking of a distant dog, and suddenly everything seems a little more sinister. At some point, around dawn, things start to change. The streets that once seemed quiet now seem strangely deserted, as if something is wrong but you can't quite put your finger on it. And it is at that moment, between tiredness and silence, that small things begin to escape your attention. You stop the car on a dark street, perhaps to rest for a few minutes or check a message on your cell phone. You are so used to the routine that you leave the car door open without even realizing it. The radio is off, so the only sound you hear is the faint hum of the streetlights and, from time to time, the rustle of something in the distance. Maybe a garbage bag blown by the wind or a cat wandering through the alleys. You look out the window, trying to see if anyone is around, but everything seems calm. And as you sit there, relaxed on the bench, that small mistake of leaving the door open begins to gain weight. Time passes and you realize that something is different. Maybe it is the air, which seems to have cooled, or the strange feeling that something is approaching. You begin to hear a sound, low, distant, but constant. It sounds like footsteps? No, it can't be. It must just be the wind, you think. But the sound continues, like someone is walking towards you, slowly, with heavy steps. Your heart starts beating faster. You try to push away the feeling of fear. After all, it must be your mind playing tricks, right? But then you feel it. A slight movement in the air next to the car, like someone is very close, outside. You turn your head slowly, trying not to show the fear that is starting to form in the pit of your stomach, and that is when you see a shadow. In the passenger window, very close. Your breathing stops for a second. The figure doesn't make a sound, it's just there, still, as if it's watching you. The dark glass of the car doesn't allow you to see the face clearly, but the outline of the person is clear enough to let your mind wander. Who is there? And, more importantly, why are you standing outside your car, in the middle of the night, on a completely deserted street? Your instinct screams at you to do something. You close the door, speed up the car, anything. But for a moment you just freeze, unable to act. The shadow moves a little and seems to be trying to open the passenger door. This is where the panic really hits. You realize that the door is open. You reach out as fast as you can and close the door with a loud click that seems to echo throughout the car. The figure outside pauses for a second, as if realizing what you did. You feel like your heart is going to jump out of your mouth because it's beating so fast. And then, as if nothing happened, the person outside just starts walking away. Slowly, as if nothing happened. You can't see where they went, but soon the street is deserted again, silent. But now, that silence, which before seemed simply calm, is filled with tension. Every little sound seems magnified and you can barely breathe properly. You sit there in the car, trying to understand what just happened. Who was that person? What did they want? And why did you leave so easily? Whatever it is, one thing is certain. You will never leave your car door open again, especially during the night shift. Because what seems like a silly distraction can make the difference between a peaceful night and a real nightmare. And in that silent darkness, you know that danger may be much closer than you think. Tell me which story made your hair stand on end? Tell me which one you liked the most? Because in the next video the story is even more chilling. Just don't forget to see if you're already subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any terrifying stories.